Picture entering a courtroom in which the destiny of a whole family, constructed upon love, religion, and scandal, is at stake. Cameras are removed, whispers permeate the air, and at its center is one man, Kody Brown, the reality star of Sister Wives, now battling not for viewership, but for his family's right to live. The command echoed across the courtroom, cutting through the din of reporters, onlookers, and clerks. At that moment, the buzz of hushed words ceased, and all eyes went to the man at the center of the controversy, Kody Brown. This was no reality television studio. There were no studio's lights or scripted do-overs. There were no glossy camera crews from TLC. Instead, there was the biting scent of wood polish, the heavy weight of silence bearing down, and the watchful eyes of a judge poised to decide whether or not Kody Brown's lifestyle was criminal or constitutional. Kody smoothed his suit jacket, his normally confident smile, now a nervous look on his face. He wasn't standing beside producers or admirers this time. He was standing with his wives, Mary, Janelle, Christine, and Robin, women who had lived with him, had faith with him, and had believed in his vision of family with him. They were standing together on the brink of one of the most critical wars of their existence. And yet, the irony was not lost on anyone present in the room. For more than a decade, millions of viewers had looked on, captivated by the strange, sometimes chaotic, but very human tale of a polygamous family in contemporary America. To many, Kody Brown was a fascination. To some, he was a role model. To others, he was a lawbreaker who sought to conceal himself behind fame achieved through reality TV. But in this courtroom, those labels were for naught. Here, there was only one question, and horrifying: was Kody Brown's family within their legal right to exist as they pleased? Or were they guilty of breaking Utah laws prohibiting polygamy? The courtroom was filled. On the left, reporters from all over the country occupied seats with notepads out, ready to record every turn of this real-life soap opera. On the right, a few subdued supporters, fans of the program, religious freedom activists, and even curious citizens, stood by, eyes wide. The bailiff's voice rang out once more as the judge arrived. All of them stood, the wooden benches groaning. The judge, a severe-looking man with steel-gray hair and reading glasses resting low on the end of his nose, sat down. He swept his eyes over the courtroom, his eyes passing briefly over Kody. The air felt heavy. Even those who had no personal stake in the outcome leaned forward, sensing that what was about to unfold was bigger than one family. Kody Brown had faced challenges before: financial strain, emotional rifts among his wives, children struggling with the pressures of growing up on national television. But nothing compared to this moment. In his head, doubt swirled. Would the judge view him as a husband, merely attempting to live his beliefs? Or would he view him as a man who was flaunting laws intended to stop precisely this way of living? He knew there weren't cameras present, but the world beyond was watching intently. He remembered his children, 18 in all, spread out across various houses, raised in the watchful eye of a nation that frequently misjudged them. How would they react if today's decision branded their family as criminals? And then, of course, there were his wives. Mary, the original wife, sat with her arms clutching tightly together, her face ashen. Janelle, more reserved, scrawled quiet scribbles in the margins of a notepad, her jaw clenched in determination. Christine, who usually wore her feelings openly on her sleeve, fidgeted nervously, but still defiantly. And Robin, the baby of the wives, clung close to Kody, her eyes flicking between the judge and the attorneys. They sat together, less like a family from a reality TV show, and more like co-defendants in a battle for their integrity. Polygamy had long been controversial in America. Once openly practiced by early Mormon pioneers, polygamy became a hot-button issue in the 19th century, sparking intense battles between the U.S. government and the LDS Church. By the late 1800s, the mainstream Mormon Church officially disavowed the practice, but smaller fundamentalist communities continued to practice it. Kody's own family had originated in that world. Although they protested that they lived in harmony according to their religion, without the abuse or compulsion so commonly coupled with polygamous cults. Nonetheless, history cast a long shadow. As Kody sat at the defense table, he was aware that the state attorneys would bring out that background, utilizing it as a weapon. To them, his family was not an innocent household opting for an alternative lifestyle. To them, he was an example of a slippery slope, a possible resurgence of practices that society had long shunned. Your Honor, the prosecutor continued, standing with a confident voice, this case is not about religion. It is about the law. Utah has explicit statutes that criminalize cohabitation in the guise of marriage. The defendants who stand before you openly profess to participating in numerous spiritual marriages, parading them before the nation on national television. This is not about private faith. This is about flaunting criminal behavior in the open. The words came like blows. Kody squirmed in his seat, but his attorney, a quiet man with glasses and a measured tone, leaned forward. Your Honor, he answered, what we are discussing is not harm, not abuse, not fraud, but love. Adults making choices about how they want to live. The government does not belong bursting into the private residence of a family, just because it appears to be different from the usual. The room was filled with tension. The judge took notes, his face inscrutable. While the lawyers sparred, all eyes occasionally drifted toward the wives. Their faces told a story words couldn't. Mary's nervous glances showed the cracks already forming in her marriage to Kody. Cracks viewers of Sister Wives would later see play out in painful detail. Janelle's calm, business-like demeanor reflected years of learning to balance independence with family life. Christine's dramatic glances gave away her terror of what would happen if they lost. And Robin's locked jaw expressed a fierce guarding of her children, particularly the younger ones who had never known life without constant media scrutiny. They were together the unspoken witnesses, the complexity of living in a plural marriage in the 21st century. For those who were on the benches, it was a show. Some whispered that the Browns had been courageous to defy outmoded laws. Others grumbled that this family had brought trouble upon themselves the day they welcomed cameras into their home. But whether to support or question, the people in the room were all in agreement on one thing. This wasn't simply a case of Kody Brown. It was a test of the limits of personal freedom in America. At some point, the judge leaned forward, his gravelly voice piercing the air. Let me remind both sides, he said. This isn't television. This is a court of law. We will not have theatrics, but only facts. The stakes here are serious. For the defendants, for the state, and for the precedent this case could set. The gavel came down again, and there was silence once more. For Kody, the words hit close. He understood, more than ever before, that this was not about fan arguments or family saga. This was about survival. The survival of his family's right to live their lives freely. When the first day of court concluded, the Browns exited past a row of blinking cameras and journalists bellowing questions. Kody did not respond. His wives huddled close, their faces weary but determined. The sun was going down outside the courthouse, where long shadows stretched across the steps where history was in the making. For Kody Brown and his 5 wives, this was just the start of a tempest that would challenge their faith, try their marriages, and transform their lives forever. The courtroom doors shut behind them, but the reverberations of that first day would echo loudly in the pages to be. The thick courtroom doors had hardly swung shut behind the Brown family when the actual gravity of the trial really started to hit home. On the walls of the courthouse, the law would pick apart their lives, their decisions, and their relationships. But to really comprehend why Kody Brown and his wives found themselves in this place, we have to back away from the messy narrative of how one family's lifestyle conflicted with Utah law. Kody Brown was raised in a belief in a religion that embraced plural marriage, a belief shared by some splinters of Mormonism, despite the mainstream LDS Church's official disavowal of the practice. For Kody, polygamy was never about rebellion. It was not about being famous. It was about family and faith. By the time America encountered him on TLC's Sister Wives in 2010, Kody had 3 wives, Mary, Janelle, and Christine, as well as over a dozen kids. Robin later joined as the 4th wife, adding additional children and drama to the family. On television, The Browns acted as a large, affectionate, if unruly family. There were birthday parties and family dinners, messy calendars and arguments. But there was laughter, support, and togetherness too. To many viewers, it opened their eyes. People got to see a polygamous family for the first time, not locked away in privacy but living openly in suburbia. But it came at a cost. In the state of Utah where the Browns resided, polygamy was not only disapproved of, it was a criminal act. Even if Kody were not technically married to more than one woman, the law went further. It made being in cohabitation with multiple partners in a marriage-like fashion a crime. That meant that although just one wife, Mary, was technically married to Kody, the fact that he cohabitated and publicly referred to Janelle, Christine, and Robin as his wives could be used against him. On TV, the Browns openly called themselves husband and wives, a title that made their domestic arrangement into potential grounds for a crime. For years, the vast majority of polygamous families remained silent, tucked away in rural environments or behind closed doors. But Kody had gone the opposite direction, going public, pushing against stereotypes, allowing the world to see that his family was not the abusive cult-like groups most folks envisioned. By doing so, though, by entering the public eye, he had also entered head-on into the crosshairs of the law. Behind the friendly faces on television, the Browns were anxious with worry. Might Kody be arrested? Might his wives be charged? What would become of their children if the state chose to step in? Privately, the discussions were somber. Christine, brought up in a plural family, confessed she was afraid of history repeating itself. "What if they steal our children away?" she once said. Janelle, ever pragmatic, questioned money and whether they should budget for legal expenses. Robin, the newest of the wives, was concerned not just for herself but for her other children from a former union who had only just achieved stability in the Brown home. And Mary, the initial wife, struggled with her own personal battle. She had initially been the legally bonded connection to Kody, but even that felt tenuous under the eyes of the law. These anxieties were not unfounded. Other Utah polygamous families had been raided, arrested, and subject to custody disputes before. The Browns understood they had put themselves under the national microscope, and the law could use that against them. Instead of waiting for the state to come knocking on their door, Kody and his wives took matters into their own hands. In 2011, they sued Utah, claiming that the state's anti-polygamy laws are unconstitutional. Their case was straightforward but compelling. Consenting adults should be allowed to live as they wish, free from the threat of being treated as criminals. They maintained that their family was founded on love and faith, not abuse or force. By criminalizing their home, the state was infringing their rights to privacy, religious freedom, and family life. It was a bold move, one which brought reality TV stars the Browns into the courts as plaintiffs for a constitutional fight. Suddenly, their personal life was not only for entertainment purposes. It was now a legal test case. When news emerged that the Browns were filing a lawsuit against Utah, the public reaction was dramatic. On the other side were advocates who viewed the family as trailblazers of individual liberty. "It's their life, their choice," went the argument. "If nobody's being hurt, why should the government bother?" For these advocates, the Browns embodied love in all its forms and a victory over oppressive, intrusive legislations. Opposed to them were critics who regarded the suit as a threat. Polygamy has a dark past, they contended, highlighting accounts of underage marriages, abuse, and women locked in repressive systems. The Browns' beaming faces on TLC were to them only a rarefied veil over a harmful practice. The media carried these debates further. Headlines blazed across headlines. Talk shows buzzed with passionate debates. And the Browns, formerly mere reality TV personalities, found themselves in the middle of a national debate about morality, freedom, and law. As the case progressed, the Browns were living in limbo. There were always questions each day. Would the state come back on them? Would the fans still be with them if the trial vilified them as lawbreakers? Would the pressure disintegrate their family? At home, the kids would occasionally catch their parents in hushed tones discussing the case. The teenage kids posed hard questions. Are we criminals because of who our parents are? Younger kids sensed the stress, even if they didn't fully comprehend it. The wives attempted to lead family life as usual. Dinners, homework, holidays, but the cloud of the courtroom hung over them. When the Browns finally entered the courtroom for the initial hearings, It was surreal. They had invited cameras into their living room for years, but this was not the same. There was no editing room, no voiceover, no opportunity to justify themselves later. Everything that was said here might alter their destiny. Their attorneys outlined the argument patiently. The Browns weren't seeking polygamy to be made legally legitimate with several marriage licenses. They were seeking the government to desist from criminalizing their decision to cohabit as a family. They sought the law to desist from regarding cohabitation as a crime. The state's lawyers, though, were equally stubborn. They insisted that polygamy was dangerous, that it was traditionally associated with abuse, and that permitting it openly would pose perilous precedents. They didn't need to show the Browns were abusers, just that the law was in its right to limit the lifestyle. Even as the court case evolved, sister wives kept on airing. Millions watched, enjoying family meals, parenting dilemmas, and even moments of happiness, all with the knowledge that behind the scenes, this family was battling for its legal existence. For the Browns, it was an odd double existence. On the one side, they were television personalities, recorded for entertainment purposes. On the other, they were complainants in a serious court case, where errors could have lifelong repercussions. The double existence served only to heighten tension. Each episode broadcasted, each public utterance made, could be analyzed not only by fans, but by lawyers and judges as well. Their home life was turned into evidence. By the time Section 2 of their tale was told, it was apparent that this was more than simply one family's battle. The Browns had become symbolic. To some, they symbolized bravery, defying archaic laws and battling for liberty. To others, however, they were a threatening example of what occurs when reality television popularizes the very practices society had long disapproved of. Either way, the courtroom was set to become the backdrop for a battle between tradition, religion, personal liberty, and state power. And as the trial accelerated, one thing was apparent: its outcome would not just determine the Browns' destiny, but also impact how America spoke of polygamy for years to come. The family was no longer just on TV, it was on trial, in every sense of the term. The thick courtroom atmosphere seemed to be able to be sliced with a knife. For weeks, rumors of the Browns' suit against Utah had dominated headlines, but now, at last, the arguments would be heard before a judge. This was no Sister Wives episode with expertly scripted drama. It was real, unedited, and life-changing. Your Honor, the lead prosecutor for the state, a large man with a big voice, started out, "This is not a case of religion, or of privacy. It is a case of law and order. Utah's prohibition against polygamy is unequivocal. The defendants before you have elected to defy that law publicly, flaunting their illegal relationships on the nation's televisions for profit and for fame." The prosecutor's words rang out across the room, each syllable calculated to bite. He depicted the Browns not as a family, but as criminals. To him, their cheerful appearances on TLC were not wholesome entertainment, but admissions of guilt. Kody Brown, stiff in his seat at the defense table, ground his teeth. He longed to jump up, to rage that his family was not some gang of criminals. But his lawyer quietly placed a hand on his arm, a reminder to keep cool. Then the defense. Kody's lawyer, a quiet but incisive man in spectacles, stood up and addressed the judge. His words were level, controlled, but each one was heavy. "Your Honor, what we have here are adults who have agreed to live their lives based on their faith. They have injured nobody. They have deceived nobody. They are not requesting multiple marriage certificates. They are requesting the liberty to be able to refer to themselves as family, without being labeled criminals for it. Is that not what America is all about? Freedom of choice, freedom of conscience, and the right to family life." Murmurs coursed through the crowd. Supporters nodded in assent. Critics shook their heads. The conflict of ideals had started. Though the wives weren't speaking that day, their presence was heard without words. Mary sat at the far left, her face ashen, hands clasped tightly in her lap. She had once been Kody's sole legal wife, and her position in this family was frequently complicated. In court, she seemed both loyal to her family and drained by the burden of public scrutiny. To her left, Janelle relaxed slightly forward, pen held in her hand, jotting down notes on the yellow pad before her. She was practical, rational, and intent on remaining calm. To her, this case wasn't so much about religion, but about the legal rights of her children to live without disgrace. Christine, normally bright-eyed and expressive, was carrying a stern mask. Her eyes moved rapidly back and forth between the lawyers and the judge, revealing her anxious energy. She grew up in a plural family and was all too familiar with the sensation of being second class. And then there was Robin, sitting nearest to Kody. Her jaw was clenched, her muscles tense. She was the newest member of the family, but maybe most vocal in private about guarding the children. Her eyes tracked every sentence of the prosecutor, like a hawk. To the crowd in the courtroom, these four women weren't simply wives, they were silent reminders of the life Kody was fighting to protect. Perhaps the most bizarre turn in the case was the involvement of Sister Wives itself. Footage from the TLC show was shown as evidence. Prosecutors maintained that the Browns had admitted publicly to polygamy on television. The family meals, the My Wife introductions, the scenes of life shared in the household, they weren't TV moments anymore. They were, the state maintained, evidence of a crime. The Browns' lawyer responded, "This show is evidence, sure, but evidence of love, evidence of everyday family life. What you see are birthday celebrations, parents loving their children, husbands and wives cooperating to get by. This is not exploitation. This is family." The courtroom was split. Some of the jurors of public opinion, the reporters in the gallery, feverishly scribbled notes, already envisioning the headlines. Others simply gazed, enthralled by the fantastical notion that reality television was being employed as courtroom evidence. At one point or another, the judge intervened, his gruff voice slicing through the sparring. "Counsel," he told the prosecutor, "are you recommending that these defendants go to jail for referring to each other as wives and husband, even without plural marriage licenses?" The prosecutor stiffened. "Yes, Your Honor. Utah law criminalizes cohabitation with more than one partner in the guise of marriage." The judge furrowed his brow. So if this same family decided to live together, but referred to themselves as friends or roommates, there would be no crime. There was a hesitation. Then the prosecutor reluctantly replied, "That is correct." The judge's pen ticked across his notes. It was a fleeting but significant moment, an indication that the law itself was constructed on shaky ground. Outside the courthouse, protesters came every day. Some held signs that said, "Family is freedom and stop criminalizing love." Others yelled invective, calling the Browns lawbreakers and immoral. TV news crews swarmed, filming every instant as if the trial were a celebrity scandal. For the Browns, leaving the courtroom each day felt like walking through a storm. Reporters shoved microphones into their faces. Fans hugged them, critics sneered, and through it all Kody kept repeating the same line, "We're just a family, like anyone else." The more prolonged the hearings, the greater the burden grew. The wives grew weary of being under the constant spotlight. The children felt it too. Teenagers were taunted at school, their peers teasing them with jokes about having four moms. Children asked poignant questions. "Mom, are we going to jail?" Each evening, Kody and his wives had family meetings. They comforted the children, reminded them of their love, and attempted to keep normal routines going. But beneath it all was a sense of increasing exhaustion. Could their family survive not only the law, but the constant scrutiny of being both public figures and defendants? What came to be revealed as the trial progressed was that this was not just about the Browns. It was about what family means in America. Was it possible for adults to make a choice outside the mainstream without government intervention? Or was the law correct in establishing a hard boundary? Supporters contended that prohibiting plural families was no different from prohibiting interracial or gay relationships decades ago. Critics contended that polygamy, regardless of how innocuous it appeared, posed dangers too pernicious to overlook. And in between were Kody Brown and his wives, the faces of a far larger debate. As the hearings dragged on, the stakes became heavier. With each testimony, each question, each newspaper headline, the pressure mounted. The Browns' lawyer counseled them in private. "This case can go either way. We've created history by challenging the law, but we have to be ready for disappointment." Nevertheless, the family clung to hope. They had entered this courtroom to defend themselves, not only to fight for a cause, the right to live as they wanted. And when the gavel fell at the end of another day's long deliberations, Everyone knew the war was far from won. The toughest part, the verdict, remained to be delivered. The courtroom was second nature to Kody Brown and his brood. Week after week, they lived the same ritual, waking the judge, sitting patiently through hours of presentations, and passing by a wave of journalists waiting outside the courthouse doors. But as the last hearings wound down, a new type of silence hung in the air. It wasn't about presentations this time. It was about a verdict. For months, the Browns had existed in a state of suspended uncertainty. Now, that uncertainty was on the verge of dissolving into something tangible, a choice that would either give them the liberty they had struggled for or seal their fate as outlaws in the eyes of the law. In the morning of the verdict, Browns sat together in court, appropriately attired for the day. Kody dressed as he always did in a suit, his hair neatly tied up, although fidgeting in his lap with his hands. The wives sat quietly, each of them lost in their thoughts. Mary's eyes were downcast, focused on the floor. Janelle stared straight ahead, her jaw tight, projecting calm even as her stomach churned. Christine shifted nervously, her foot tapping against the wooden floor. Robin held her breath, silently praying. The atmosphere was thick. Reporters leaned forward with pens ready. Supporters clasped hands as though waiting for a sermon. Opponents smirked, confident the law would prevail. The judge came in, and the room stood. The ring of the gavel was louder than normal, a reminder that whatever would be said next would resound far beyond these walls. As the judge started to pronounce his verdict, the Browns prepared themselves. His voice was calm, measured. In weighing the arguments before this court, he said, "This court concludes that Utah's criminalization of cohabitation violates the rights of consenting adults to live by their own belief." The words sank in gradually. There was silence first, then whispers spread wildfire through the room. Reporters wrote frantically. Supporters gasped with relief. And at the defense table, Kody and his wives sat in stunned looks. The judge went on, "Cohabitation statute, applied to this case, is unconstitutional." It was a win, not total, but significant. For the first time, a federal judge had invalidated some of Utah's anti-polygamy statute. The Browns were not criminals. Their way of life, although still unorthodox, was not against the law the way the state had claimed. Tears fell in Christine's eyes. Janelle shut her notebook, and at last permitted herself a small smile. Robin hugged Kody, whispering a prayer of thanks. Mary, ever more reserved, took a deep breath, her shoulders sagging as if a heavy burden had at last been released. For Kody, the experience was otherworldly. He had arrived in court with the weight of centuries of shame on him, afraid of prison, afraid of losing his children. Now, at least for this moment, he was vindicated. Cameras mobbed the family outside the courthouse. "Mr. Brown, how do you feel the court's ruling?" one journalist shouted. "Does this make polygamy legal in Utah?" another asked. Kody, his wives in tow, stood up above the commotion. "This decision is not only for us, it's for all families who've taken a different road. Today, we are acknowledged as human beings, not criminals." Supporters in the crowd cheered. News media had no delay. Headlines were broadcast across the nation. "Sister wives win landmark court case. Judge strikes down part of Utah polygamy law." Reality TV family scores, legal victory. Talk shows weighed in with argument. Some hailed the decision as a move toward freedom and openness. Others cautioned it would lead to deviant practices. Social networks buzzed with #Brown family victory and #polygamy debate. The Browns were TV celebrities for weeks, national icons for a cultural war. But legal victories never come easy. At once, polygamy's critics launched a backlash. Religious leaders, politicians, and activists decried the ruling. "This is pernicious," one Utah senator stated on TV. "This ruling undermines decades of effort to keep women and children safe from polygamous abuse." Groups fighting against polygamy cautioned that the ruling would energize fundamentalist cults that have been known to abuse underage girls and coerce marriage. They maintained that Brown's reality TV charisma diverted the public's attention from the grim realities of plural marriage in other communities. The state of Utah wasted no time in appealing the ruling, determined to overturn the decision. Within the Brown family, The win created happiness, but also added stress. To the children, it meant they no longer had to worry about their family being illegal. To the wives, it was assurance of their decision to live as they felt. But beneath the celebration, cracks were forming. Years of legal battles, financial strain, and public scrutiny had taken a toll. Mary's marriage to Kody was already fragile, weighed down by emotional distance. Christine, though relieved by the ruling, began to question her happiness in the plural arrangement. Janelle buried herself in work, trying to stay practical amidst the chaos. Robin deeply bonded to Kody, worried about the family's long-term survival under constant spotlight. The victory in the courtroom hadn't resolved the internal issues at home. In fact, pressure had amplified them. In 2016, only 3 years since their very first triumph, the Browns were hit by calamitous news. The 10th Circuit Court of Appeals overruled most of the decision, restoring Utah's power to enforce its cohabitation ban. For the family, the rug had been pulled from beneath them. What they perceived as freedom was transformed into uncertainty again. While Utah officials gave notice they had no inclination to prosecute such families as the Browns, the law once again loomed over their lives. Kody expressed his frustration in interviews. "We fought for freedom, and for a moment we thought that we had it. Now it seems like we're back to square one." Supporters were disappointed. Opponents felt vindicated. And the Browns once again were left to puzzle through a legal labyrinth. Despite the defeat, the Browns' courtroom battle had a lasting impact. Their case ignited national debate, compelling Americans to ask hard questions. Should the government be able to police consenting adults' private relationships? Where is the balance between protecting society from harm and protecting individual freedom? Can the Browns be divorced from the darker history of polygamy? The suit did not topple polygamy statutes in Utah, but it did shift the dialogue. For the first time in recent history, a plural family had stood publicly in court, defied the law, and prevailed, albeit temporarily. For Sister Wives fans, the court case brought a new depth to the show. It wasn't simply about family drama any longer. It was about survival, rights, and identity. The Browns weren't merely balancing birthdays and holidays. They were battling the government. And for the Browns themselves, the experience transformed their future. While court fights ceased, domestic fights raged on. Marriages were broken, children matured and expressed their own views regarding plural marriage. The formerly solid family was fractured. But amidst it all, the courtroom win, and eventual reversal, was an enduring chapter in their narrative. On that day of 2013, when the gavel fell for the first time in their favor, the Browns had hope they had never known before. It was a sign that they counted, that their family existed, that their struggle was worth it. After the reversal, that gavel still resounded. It reminded them that they had tested the system, and for a moment they had succeeded. And whether they were loved or hated, nobody could argue with it. The Browns had altered the dialogue for good. When the dust finally cleared, one thing was certain. The courtroom wars of Kody Brown and his wives were more than a legal fight of a family. They became a cultural watershed, igniting national discussions regarding freedom, morality, family, and government intervention in individual lives. The Browns entered court as reality television personalities, but they emerged as unwilling icons in America's continued battle over the limits of choice and tradition. At first, the majority of viewers perceived Sister Wives as another reality series. It was odd, even provocative, yet still marketed with the same ingredients which made other shows on TLC successful: large families, tense fights, and an unconventional lifestyle. But post-lawsuit, the Browns could no longer be reduced to just TV. They had dared to challenge the law. They had risked their privacy, their reputations, and their ability to work. And by doing so, they challenged America to answer some hard questions. Should the government determine how many partners one is allowed to have? Is love only valid if it is within a traditional context? Or is freedom larger than that? The Browns became trailblazers, whether they liked it or not. Their struggle broke open a discussion that had lain for decades in the shadows of shame. Not all people regarded the Browns as pioneers. Some considered them champions of personal freedom. They claimed that adults who consented to anything were free to live as they desired, and that the Browns' candor was refreshing in light of secretive polygamous cults, which had contributed to plural marriage's reputation as something sinister. Others viewed them differently. However, critics charged that the Browns sugarcoated an abusive practice. They cited fundamentalist communities in which polygamy was accompanied by abuse, child marriage, and women stripped of agency. The Browns are the friendly face of a dangerous system, stated one activist in a documentary. This polarization became part of their legacy. For each fan rallying behind them, there was a critic cautioning that the win would embolden abusers. And in many respects, this polarity mirrored the broader cultural debate. Where do we put our lines about freedom and protection? The Brown suit did not repeal Utah's anti-polygamy statutes, but it did send ripples throughout the community. Families who had lived in secret suddenly held out hope. Plural Families' online forums were flooded with encouraging messages. Thanks to the Browns, I finally spoke to my parents about my lifestyle, one woman said anonymously. Another man with 2 wives in Arizona said the case emboldened him to no longer hide. I'm not in front of the TV camera, but if they can battle the law, maybe I don't need to be in fear anymore. Despite the appeals court overturning much of the Browns' victory, the symbolic force of their struggle was still intact. They had placed polygamy in the headlines in a new manner, not as an embarrassment, but as a debate about rights. For the Browns themselves, the battle in the courtroom was both empowering and draining. It defined their future in ways they could never have conceived. Kody came more fervent about his job as a protector of his way of life. He frequently discussed the ruling in interviews, presenting it as evidence that his family was misconstrued but resilient. However, the pressure of years in the spotlight eroded his marriages. Mary, who was already emotionally removed, retreated further after the court fight. Christine, who at first had only celebrated the victory, afterward conceded that the legal turmoil had caused her to question whether the lifestyle really brought her happiness. Janelle remained practical, yet the weight of public scrutiny was immense. Robin, most like Kody in nature, held fast to the belief that the family had accomplished something worthwhile, even though it was at such a great price. The legal battle had brought them together in public, but in private it also revealed the fissures in their union. The Sister Wives franchise changed too after the lawsuit. What was originally a show about family celebrations became something more. An account of perseverance, scandal, and identity. Fans weren't simply watching to catch birthday celebrations or family meals anymore. They wanted to know what's next for the Browns. How would the court case change their lives? Episodes started incorporating more of the legal plotline, with court documents, lawyer sessions, and unscripted discussion on fear and hope. Ratings shot up during the lawsuit years, as viewers who may never have cared about polygamy all of a sudden wanted to watch the Browns battle. The court case made the show more substantial. It wasn't simply entertainment anymore. It was history in the making on television. Maybe the Browns' courtroom drama left the biggest legacy in how it transformed the national conversation. For decades, polygamy was only whispered about, identified with cults, secrets, and abuse. The Browns broke that narrative. They introduced themselves as plain Americans, parents, employees, neighbors. Their case challenged lawmakers, academics, and even spiritual authorities to reconsider the issue of plural marriage. Should legislation be modified to embrace contemporary conceptions of freedom, or should it remain resistant to avoid possible damage? Though the legal result didn't repeal polygamy prohibitions, the cultural result was irrepressible. Folks were discussing. Dinner plates, classrooms, and pews rang with arguments triggered by the Browns' tale. Outside of politics, the Browns made an impact on popular culture. Sister Wives jokes cropped up in late-night talk show monologues. Parodies emerged online. So did poignant essays, documentaries, and podcasts examining the intricacies of plural marriage. The Browns had made a once tacky topic respectable dinner conversation, and even those who disagreed with them couldn't help but acknowledge they had opened a door that could not be closed. Ultimately, the Browns' legacy was not winning or losing in court. It was about courage. They stood in front of the world, bared their lives, and battled a system larger than themselves. For others, they will always be in dispute, reminders of a way of life that defies convention. For others, they will always be symbols of liberty, evidence that ordinary individuals can defy the law and insist on being heard. Either way, their bravery cannot be in doubt. Looking back, it's almost poetic. A reality show meant to entertain became the spark for a national debate. A family once dismissed as unconventional became the center of a constitutional question. And a courtroom battle that began with fear ended with a legacy that still shapes conversations today. The Brown's Tale is something more than television melodrama. It's about the strength to live honestly, the cost of defying convention, and the messy beauty of family, in whatever configuration. As the gavel fell and the courtroom cleared, one thing was certain: for better or worse, the Browns made the world take notice. And that is something no law can undo.